Hello and welcome for the Ukrainian and the global audience here from the studio in Kiev, a special webcast of the Atlantic Council and Hromadske. These are the series Maidan Lives On. We've already started talking a month ago around about the reforms Ukraine is making, but tonight we will have a closer look at the conflict at the East and Ukrainian reforms during the wartime. For that, I'm joined with my co-moderator, Simon Ostrovsky of the Vice News, who himself just came back from the East and probably would be ready to tell what's happening there and also introduce our guests.
So we've got two U.S. ambassadors to Kiev here, one former, one current. This is Ambassador Pyatt, who is currently the U.S. ambassador here. And we've got former Ambassador John Herbst, who's now from the Atlantic Council's EURASIA Center, which was involved in setting up this event. And we're glad to have both of you here. I think we're going to start with Ambassador Herbst. And I wanted to ask you what it's like coming back after 8 years. You were here during the Orange Revolution, which was a time when Ukraine tried to reform itself.
But I just technically would explain that we want to have this series to be interactive, so everybody is welcome to send the question. We already some of them using the hashtag Maidan Lives On. You can see that on our social networks and on the social networks of all of us. As well, we are speaking here in English. In Ukrainian, you can watch the series on the Ukrainian webpage of Hromadske.TV, and you have the links all over the place that you can watch it in English and then the Atlantic Council.
Okay. So, as I was saying, Ambassador Herbst, Ukraine was going through a reform process that got cut off after you left the country, and now it's trying to reform itself again, but there's a war going on. Do you think it's going to be possible for Ukraine to push through the reforms that the protesters on the Maidan were asking for when this whole thing started off?
Well, first of all, Ukraine, even at independence, was relatively advanced in having a civil society that was active, and it had, at least at that time, a little bit of influence. And over the past 20 plus years, that civil society has become ever more active and more influential. You would not have had an Orange Revolution back when I was ambassador had civil society not been active. It's become even stronger over the past 8 years, in part because of technological changes. Twitter did not exist 8 years ago. As we saw during the Arab Spring, Facebook and Twitter were major mobilizing forces, and they've been an important factor here. The Maidan in 2013 and 2014 was even more powerful and more able to produce effective change than the Maidan in 2004. So I think there is a new generation emerging in Ukraine that is saying no to the soft autocracy and heavy corruption that has characterized Ukraine in almost its entire independence period. Yushchenko was a Democrat. He was not an authoritarian. Pretty much everyone else was. But corruption, of course, was also a serious problem during Yushchenko's time. What's not clear, however, is whether the current political leadership has the instinct and the ability to produce the reforms necessary that the people on the Maidan are insisting upon. These folks are all old figures, old by which I mean they've been in power or near power for over a decade. And the people who are demanding serious change that will make Ukraine a modern society, a democratic society, are a generation younger than the people who are currently in power. And it may be that we're going to see some fumbling on the reform front over the next year, 2 or 3, because there'll be an instinct among those who have the power to play the old-style games. One more important point, as your question suggested, this is a more difficult moment than the Orange Revolution, because the Orange Revolution was overwhelmingly, not entirely, but overwhelmingly a domestic crisis. Today, Ukraine's domestic crisis has become principally an international crisis. And it's interesting, there's an irony here. It's become an international crisis precisely because the reformers, the new Ukraine has won decisively domestically. Mr. Putin believed incorrectly that divisions between the east and the west of Ukraine were as strong as they were 20 years ago, and that the east was interested in moving towards Moscow, not towards Europe. He didn't realize that the young in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Odessa are Ukrainian. They are not looking to Moscow for inspiration. Maybe their parents are, but they are not. And that's why even under the automati of Russia's hired hands and the Russian officers who are leading the insurrection in eastern Ukraine, the insurgency in eastern Ukraine, 3,000 students demonstrated at Luhansk University on behalf of a unitary Ukraine. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Ambassador Pyatt whether, a question I think that a lot of Ukrainians are asking themselves, which is, can Ukraine actually count on strong U.S. support? Because the United States is busy right now in Iraq, they're still busy in Afghanistan, and Ukraine doesn't even feature very often in the headlines in American newspapers anymore. So how strongly, when we're talking about the Russians actually providing their supporters in eastern Ukraine with weapons, and the United States is talking about providing the Ukrainian army with non-lethal assistance like night vision goggles, which, by the way, I haven't even seen on the front lines, which I've come back from. I don't think they've been delivered yet. So how strong is the support that the United States can offer Ukraine while it's basically in a state of war?
2 quick points on it. First, the United States is deeply committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity. It's non-negotiable. We're going to stand by our European partners, by most of the international community, refusing to recognize the occupation and annexation of Crimea. We're going to continue to work with Europe, with our international partners, to have a strong response to Russian aggression in the East. That can be taken for granted. But I also emphasize, I think over the long term, the thing that is going to most strongly defend Ukraine, that's going to make Ukraine a harder target for those who would seek the failure of its democratic revolution, is a healthy, economically healthy Ukraine, politically healthy Ukraine, a Ukraine where corruption has been rooted out. And those are all tasks that have to be accomplished by this country's political leadership, but they will do so with strong support from the United States. We put our money where our mouth is with $1 billion credit line, our work with Europe, our work with the rest of the international community to help put Ukraine on a healthy and European destined footing.
Right, but I mean, as I was saying, Russia's putting its money where its mouth is in another way. They're bringing in rocket-propelled grenade launchers with heat-seeking missiles that can take down airplanes. There have been reports of T-64, pretty sophisticated tanks coming into the hands of the separatists. So it's like Ukraine is almost dealing with an army that's at par. And the United States isn't providing the same kind of support to a country which has declared itself to be pro-Western and wants to go down that Western route. It's not going to be able to enact those economic reforms that you're talking about that are going to help it develop if it loses in eastern Ukraine.
Well, again, there's no military solution to this crisis. It has to be solved politically. Ukraine can't change its geography. Russia is going to be a big neighbor. What we can do and what we are doing is helping to improve Ukraine's capacity to defend itself. We've increased our military assistance to $23 million since the beginning of this year. We're also beginning the process of working with Ukraine to assess its requirements, to train Ukrainian military, to help Ukraine to develop what President Poroshenko says he wants, which is a NATO standard military, which meets Western standards in terms of professionalism, in terms of competence. That's something that we also can help with, and we're moving ahead on that very quickly.
And as Ambassador Herbst was saying, Poroshenko is a politician who comes from the old guard. I think he supported the Maidan, but he represents the older generation. Is this somebody who's really going to be able to live up to the expectations of all of those protesters? I mean, he's burdened by a number of things, by that history of being an oligarch, like many of the politicians in this country have been, and also by the fact that he owns a lot of companies and enterprises around the country, which would perhaps be a conflict of interests when he's making decisions about which direction the country should head. I mean, he's even got a shipbuilding factory in Crimea. So in his dealings with Russia, he may be thinking about his property that he has in Crimea, and perhaps not about the interests of the Ukrainian people. Is that something that either of you have thought about?
I dealt a great deal with Mr. Poroshenko when I served in Ukraine. And yes, he's an oligarch. And yes, he is used to dealing in the old ways. But it's also true that he's had a great breadth of experience in the government. And he has associated himself with the best instincts of the country and of reformers in times of crisis. He did join with Yushchenko well before Yushchenko won the presidential election of 2004. So he's been willing to take risks to move the country in the right direction. He also grew in stature over the past 6 or 7 months because he took risks reaching out to Europe after Mr. Yanukovych turned away from the trade deal with the EU. So I think he has a good sense as to what the country needs. And I think he has a pragmatic talent that could push the country or move the country in the right direction. What's not clear is if he can overcome some other practices that were part of his public and private life in Ukraine since independence, and whether he has the ability to pull along enough people of talent to make the necessary changes that would put the country on the right path.
What practices are you talking about?
Well, most people who became very rich in Ukraine since independence did not do it by creating companies from scratch that provided a basic need. They became rich by having special access to government's resources that actually belong to the Ukrainian people. And that, of course, is a talent which does not build a strong economy or a fair society. And the habits you build or you develop in your formative years are not so easy to break. And even if you break them, you have to persuade others to stop taking from the public purse. People who were once your colleagues or competitors. And you have to develop a talented cadre of people who share your vision for the country to take serious reform measures. And that's not easy to do. For that reason, I think it's important that the international financial institutions and Ukraine's friends in the West keep a close watch on what's happening here and encourage Mr. Poroshenko to follow the guide of his better nature, which is there. And obviously he's a very talented man.
To go back to what you were saying about there not being a military solution to this conflict, I think Poroshenko, Ukraine, tried that last week by unilaterally declaring a ceasefire to give a chance to the rebels, the separatists in eastern Ukraine, to withdraw if they chose to do so, but that didn't happen. The fighting continued almost at the same level as it had been in the preceding week before the ceasefire was declared. Who can guarantee that if an agreement is reached, that the rebels who are linked to Moscow but not necessarily take direct orders from them always are going to follow through with that, and that there can be a solution that isn't military with those groups, that wouldn't follow a peace deal?
Well, let me say a couple of things, Simon. First, of course, we hope very much that this declaration out of Berlin today will provide the beginnings of a diplomatic off-ramp to this crisis. A lot's going to depend on Russia's actions and Russia's signals over the next hours. As you say, what didn't happen last time was the separatists reciprocating the government's unilateral ceasefire. President Poroshenko has made very clear the United States supports his position that any ceasefire going forward needs to be reciprocal and verified. We will work closely with the OSCE to support their verification role with foreign ministers. The Normandy Group foreign ministers have identified in Berlin. But ultimately, this is going to hinge on Russia. Russia has the capacity, if it chooses to do so, to police its borders, to ensure that T-64 tanks and missile launchers and mercenaries don't move across the border, as they've been doing for the past months, to send a clear signal to the separatists that there is going to be no Donetsk People's Republic, there is going to be no Novorossiya, that their future lies in finding an accommodation within the framework of the Ukrainian constitution, of the Ukrainian democracy, and the very substantial offer that President Poroshenko has put on the table in terms of devolution of authority, constitutional reforms, targeted economic assistance to the Donbass, linguistic assurances. These are all on the table, and the United States has been thoroughly impressed by the steps that President Poroshenko has taken. Now we're going to focus on actions, not words, and most of those actions have to come both from the separatists and the separatist leaders, and crucially from Moscow and the signals that Moscow presents.
But if Russia's more interested in seeing Ukraine fail than you're interested in seeing Ukraine succeed, then that kind of an agreement won't be possible. And if Russia continues playing that kind of a role, what steps can the United States take to put that into place? Aside from working with the OSCE and holding meetings, is there anything stronger that the United States could put down on the table to restrain Russia in eastern Ukraine?
Well, we and our European partners have made it clear that if Russia persists in its destabilizing activities and its aggression in eastern Ukraine, there will be a cost to that. We hope that that cost can be implemented jointly with our European partners. I think it's important that this agreement was struck in Berlin, and Chancellor Merkel and Foreign Minister Steinmeier have played a central role in driving this diplomacy. And we want to ensure that our activities are supported with that. We're also going to continue working, as we've been doing, to support the Ukrainian government's unilateral efforts to enforce its border, a border which, as you know, is largely wide open at this point. So a lot of our assistance has been targeted at the state border guard services. We'll be looking at other steps we can take. I should note that here, too, close partnership with Europe in the context of the association agreement, the free trade agreement, the work that Europe is doing towards visa-free access for the Ukrainians. All of that requires the ability to police the frontier between Ukraine and Russia. So this will happen regardless of what unfolds with the political process. But as I said, we fervently hope that this breakthrough in Berlin today will be the beginning of a diplomatic offering. But we're going to stick with our support to this government and their actions.
We do have questions from our audience, as I really invite everybody to jump in. And there is a question from Anne Applebaum, the journalist and the thinker. And it is like, is the US misleading Ukraine, implying support that won't come as in Georgia 2008? That is the one thing, yeah. And that would...
Okay.
Yeah.
There is an assumption in that question which is not correct. The United States did not promise Mr. Saakashvili support for a war with Russia in 2008. Condi Rice, who was then Secretary of State, Dan Fried, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, both warned Mr. Saakashvili not to take steps that would lead to a war with Russia. So that assumption is incorrect. Regarding the current situation in Ukraine, I'm happy to provide an answer, although Jeff, you may want to answer that. I will follow your lead on this. Okay. I think the United States has provided a certain measure of support for Ukraine, and that measure of support has been adequate. We have led the charge for sanctions that would deter Mr. Putin. Unfortunately, the European response on sanctions has been inadequate. Can I finish? Because this is actually, I'm trying to answer the question in a thorough way. I would have said as recently as Sunday that the European response on sanctions was barely adequate. But as of Monday evening, it was inadequate. The Europeans laid down a clear marker in early June that Russia had 30 days to control its border, to use the Orwellian language, to de-escalate its support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine, or they would face sectoral sanctions. There was a ceasefire. During that ceasefire, at least 10 T-64 tanks crossed the border from Russia. Rocket launchers, very sophisticated equipment crossed the border. More Russian national fighters crossed the border. People of Russian extraction, of Russian nationality. Russian citizenship, not necessarily just Russian nationality, crossed the border. So clear Russian upping its interference in Ukraine's internal affairs. And the EU backed down from imposing sanctions. That was a disgrace. Now, coming to the United States. The United States was encouraging Europe to do the right thing. It's my understanding. The United States was not successful in persuading Europe to do the right thing on sanctions. But in fact, the United States holds a trump card, which I believe it should play. We have the ability unilaterally to impose crippling sanctions on Russia. It was our ability to control internationally the use of the dollar in financial transactions, which explains why you have serious sanctions on Iran and on Sudan. The Europeans did not want those sanctions. We pushed ahead, and as a result of our pushing ahead to say dollar transactions will not be permitted, since we, the United States, issue the dollar, and anyone who conducts dollar transactions with Iran or Sudan is subject to American courts and American sanctions. It's because of that we have serious sanctions on Iran and Sudan. My personal belief, my personal recommendation to Washington, is that the United States should pursue a similar sanction against Russia. If we do that, the Europeans will have no choice but to go along. One major issue between the United States and France today is this question of sanctions related to Iran and Sudan, as a result of which we levied a $9 billion fine on BNP. Similar things would happen for Western Europeans who want to do business with corrupt Russians, or for that matter, Russian national financial institutions, if we did the same thing. And I believe the United States should look at this seriously. I would hope the administration would do this, but if not, I think Congress may need to act.
I think it's important to get the sitting ambassador to say if he supports sanctions as strong as Iran against Russia.
Well, thanks, Simon. I mean, let me say two things. First of all, I have an enormous respect for Anne Applebaum, who's really been one of the leading scholars in helping us to understand what's happening in this part of the world. I think the premise of her question is a little bit unfounded, because there has been what I would suggest is probably an unprecedented level of dialogue at the senior-most levels of our governments between President Obama, who had Prime Minister Yatsenyuk in the Oval Office in March, who met with President Poroshenko in Warsaw for an hour, even before President Poroshenko was sworn in. Dozens of telephone calls by Vice President Biden, even more involving Secretary of State Kerry. So the current Ukrainian leadership has had, since the last days of February, a very clear understanding of American policy bottom lines, of American concerns, and I think a very realistic sense of what we can and cannot do, given the realities of geography. I think on the question of sanctions, what I would emphasize tonight is that our toolbox is not empty. A lot of the considerations that John laid out are being actively debated right now in Washington and, of course, in Brussels. And again, very intensive Washington-Berlin, Washington-Paris, Washington-London, Washington-Brussels conversations. And I don't think we're done unless there is a dramatic improvement in the approach that Russia takes to its support for de-escalation in Ukraine, cessation of destabilizing activities, and now support for the Berlin document.
So Iran-level sanctions not on the table just yet?
The toolbox isn't empty.
And would you agree with your with the former ambassador's frustration over the European Union's inability to put in place the sanctions that they promised?
I'm in a different spot, and I will just say that I have an extraordinary relationship with Ambassador Tombinski, my EU counterpart, and a much easier job, because he has 28 bosses and I have one.
Coming to that, there are, if we talk about Europe, there are these 2 assault ship Mistrals, which are going to be sold to Russia. At the moment, there are a few hundred Russian officers at Saint-Lazare who are on training there. I mean, France tells that, and a lot of people in Europe tells that one country cannot bear the whole price if it cancels the contract. And there are, so what would be the policy? I mean, there are ideas, maybe somebody else would buy these ships, or the NATO, or somebody. If we understand that it's financial loss for one country, like France, what else can be done that you don't have these ships later on in Sevastopol?
Well, I'll say 2 issues. I mean, first of all, this is the nature of international leadership. France is a leading international country, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And the United States has made clear our view that we believe that this transaction is inappropriate at this moment in light of Russia's military aggression and its illegal occupation of Crimea.
Because it wouldn't be a pretty picture to see them dock in Sevastopol in a couple of months' time.
No, it would not.
And that's exactly what's going to happen, isn't it? If they do sell these ships.
I've stopped making any predictions about
The training are taking place now. There was a demonstration against it, but that's how it is. That's nothing else. And I do have another questions, of course. So beside that, there would be from the interpreter, James Miller, what is the chance that the Ukraine anti-terrorist triggers a Russian invasion? What can West do to stop that from happening?
I think there's a very good chance. I think it's unlikely that there will be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that Mr. Putin really does not want crushing Western sanctions. And even a reluctant Germany, a reluctant France would be unable to stop major sanctions against Russia if the Russian army poured across the border. But at the present time, Europe is willing to let the Kremlin get away with running a major insurgency in Ukraine, led by a Russian colonel, financed with Russian money, involving Russian military equipment. And until there's a very clear signal from the West that this form of Russian aggression will not be permitted, he doesn't have to consider sending in his army in order to destabilize Ukraine's east. If he finally understands that there are limits to what the West will accept, what Europe really will accept, in the way of Russian aggression in the east, the Ukrainian army will be able to take care of this Russian-led insurgency, and then we'll find out if he's willing to send his army across the border. I think the answer is no, but I don't know that for certain.
If you want to go on, but there is a question also from Ian Hansen from the Central and Eastern European Institute. So it's called like, how does the US specifically counter Russian propaganda in Ukraine without feeding Kremlin narrative of Western interference?
No, it's a great question, and I think one of the most striking things about the past 4 months to me has been the way in which Moscow has weaponized its information activities in Ukraine. Most of what I read in Russian media about this country bears no resemblance to the city I live in. And my glib answer to the question is you need to have a lot more Russians come to Kyiv and walk around, discover that it's a Russian-speaking city, discover that it's a tolerant and inclusive city. So that's the first point. I also worry a great deal about how the extraordinarily blown up information environment in Russia today is blowing back on Russia's own political debate. Again, because the narrative that's being told in Russia today about Ukraine's aspirations, about Ukraine's vision of its relationship with Russia is so disconnected from the reality that it is leading, I would fear, to bad policy choices. I was particularly pleased when I was in Lviv a couple of weeks ago, Nataliya, to meet with some of the leadership at UKU, who described
at Ukrainian Catholic University.
At the Catholic University, to hear what they are doing in terms of bringing young people from eastern Ukraine out to Lviv for weekends, to come and see that there are not a bunch of Banderists and fascists running around conducting pogroms. And I am absolutely convinced as John said earlier, that the most important fault line that runs through Ukrainian society today, insofar as there is one, is the generational one. This is a country which is strongly united. For me, one of my defining memories of the Maidan period will be November 15th, just before the crisis broke publicly, but after we knew that Yanukovych had decided to back away from the association agreement. And you had Ukraine's World Cup qualifier, which they won against France. And the sense of unity at Olimpijski Stadium that evening will always stick with me. And nobody was asking, the goalkeeper was a guy named Pyatt, and nobody was asking if he was from Lviv or Kharkiv or if he spoke Ukrainian or Russian or Tatar at home. And in that regard, again, I think the most important requirement right now is not a US propaganda campaign. It's for Ukraine to do what the government has begun to do in terms of explaining what this country is all about and what Ukrainians aspire to for the future.
We have already here, waiting the Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister Danylo Lubkivsky, who will be able to share with us some thoughts about probably the meeting in Berlin Foreign Ministry. But before that, we really would like to ask, you've been one of the authors of this New York Times op-ed about the former ambassadors, don't forget Crimea.
Give Steve Pfeiffer the principal credit for that.
Yep. And that at the same time, what is the way not to forget on the international level? Bearing in mind as well, there are recent news, for instance, reported by such a news media like Black Sea News, where they monitor and see that, for instance, there was a Bulgarian ship coming to the Sevastopol, and Bulgaria is a NATO member. It was not a Navy ship, but it was a usual ship. There were ships belonging to Turkish companies, which are Turkey is a NATO member, but it's also like a private ships. But there were also, there was some evidence that might be some ships are coming from Novorossiysk, from Russia to Crimea, as well with some, at the same time, it looks like it goes like the usual business that, a lot of, there are reasons to believe that some companies and some countries try to make it go on the business as usual and forget about Crimea in that way.
Certainly, people will follow their own interest as they understand their own interest. And so businessmen who could make money in Crimea would like to make money in Crimea without reference to the circumstances there. But as we suggest in that editorial, steps can be taken to make it very costly for someone to try to earn money in Crimea. So we should Ukraine should apply international law regarding economic activity in Crimea, so that people who seek profit there are subject to international law and international sanction. And of course, Ukraine has an extremely strong case. And I suspect if Ukraine were to pursue this, I can't speak for my own government any longer, but I think the United States and Europe would follow. And of course, if international courts back up Ukraine, it would be very hard for people to return to business as usual in a Russian, quote-unquote, annexed Crimea.
I think that's something we should ask the Deputy Foreign Minister who's about to come into the studio about, because I think personally that the Ukrainian government hasn't been doing anything very obvious in terms of applying international law to control the airspace and the sea around Crimea in order to try to apply a cost to Russia's occupation of their peninsula.
So while we have, I think now we have already Danylo Lubkivsky here, while we should change the mics and have this, it won't be a technical break, there would be the question from Sabra Iris, who is actually a journalist writing about Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine and the world. That sounds like, how can Ukraine, that would be the question, how can Ukraine counter the propaganda war that has so greatly influenced the mindset in the East? How would you advise them? You shortly talk about that, but maybe you would add.
Yeah, thanks, Nataliya. Again, I think the question of communications is a critically important one because of the way in which Moscow has sought to use information as part of its armory, the way in which Moscow has sought to use this information warfare to advance its goal of sowing instability in eastern Ukraine. It's not a coincidence that so many journalists have been taken hostage. It's not a coincidence that the Slavyansk TV tower is now lying in rubble because it's been fought over. It's not a coincidence that one of the first things that these Russian teams have done as they've come into cities is bring digital equipment and take over the radio and the television and switch it all over to Moscow stations. And I don't know if Simon's had the same experience, but I've heard from other American journalists who've been out in eastern Ukraine who describe their fixers and their drivers complaining about how they can't find their old radio stations in the car because of these changes that have been made. So it's a critical issue. It needs to be understood as part of the battle for minds that the government is engaged in. I think President Poroshenko is conscious of this. It's not a coincidence that he was talking long before he was elected about how his first trip, if elected, was going to be to the Donbass, and he made good on that promise. And of course, Danylo has been at the point of the spear in terms of the Ukrainian government's efforts to address these issues, and it's an effort that I would strongly encourage because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's misinformation in Europe. You go to key European capitals. I was hosting some German journalists at my house last month, and all of them were talking about how disconnected the narrative that they read at home was from what they found when they came to Kyiv, met with civil society, walked on the Maidan, met with President Poroshenko and the political leaders. And that's ultimately a job for the Ukrainian government. Welcome to that.
Great. Jeff, thank you very much. And I'm really glad to see you here and to contribute to your profound discussion, as I've heard it staying behind. And I do thank you for all your personal efforts to bring peace to the eastern part of Ukraine and to the efforts of the United States administration and government, since we do feel the strong support of our real partners and friends. So I'm glad to see you, and I do thank you for the invitation, so I'm glad to be part of your discussion.
Gives the opportunity to the, thanks for coming, for the global audience, wherever who want to address the question to you, to use this opportunity to, but there one is starting. We have already some on the standby. Russia these days carrying everybody with the prediction that will follow as the result of the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, that cheap goods would flow the markets, the local markets will be destroyed, and so forth. What are the most realistic and sober prognoses for that? And what would happen if the agreement comes to reality?
That's a very interesting question. As you understand, we do not share the concerns of the Russian Federations. Even more, we do believe that the association agreement that Ukraine has with the European Union will bring additional benefits to the Russian Federation in economic, technical terms, and so on. But let me start from some good news that we have, not only about the association agreement, and we will continue with that, but let me say that we have a few positive developments, and the most important is that Nastya Stanko and her teammate from Hromadske TV have been successful and finally released, so let me congratulate you on that.
I would interrupt because we kindly ask by them and by our team not to call them too much at the moment, because there are a number of calls to everybody, so give a bit of peace and rest for the team.
Reasonable.
It was about an hour ago that we were very happy to have as all the colleagues, reminding that there are a lot of other journalists still take place, the local journalists, the regional journalists whose international or nationwide profile is not that high, but they also should be freed.
That sounds very reasonable. Let me also add that unfortunately, despite of this positive development, 170 persons remain hostages of the Russian terrorists in the eastern Ukraine. That's why we should continue and redouble our efforts to do everything possible to release these people. I will be back to the point that you made about the association agreement, but let me also mention this peace plan efforts and the talks that have been concluded in Berlin. Ukraine's stance is very clear, and I would like to highlight three major points. First of all, we are strongly committed to the peaceful solution to the crisis. And that's our strong and clear stance, and we are glad that our European and American partners do support this approach. But the second thing is that our desire to bring peace doesn't mean that we can allow the Russian terrorists continue their efforts and to continue their aggression and to continue killings and violence. You know that President Poroshenko declared the unilateral ceasefire, and during that period we faced more than 100 incidents, attacks by Russian terrorists against Ukrainian peacekeepers, bodyguards, and so on. That's a disaster. I mean, we do understand that the Russian terrorists in the eastern part of Ukraine do not have any precise, clear political agenda. We do understand that Russia stands behind their steps and actions. That's why the decision of President Poroshenko to renew the active phase of anti-terrorist operation was caused by the absence of the political will coming from the Kremlin to use all their direct political influence over the terrorists over there in those locations. And the third point is that we have some positive developments, indications, I will tell, coming from Berlin. If we look at the current situation, we will see that, that there is a natural question how we can ensure peace over there. And there are three major responses. First of all, we have to ensure a sustainable bilateral ceasefire. The second point, we have to release all hostages. And the third thing is that we have to ensure border control. The negotiation talks, consultations in Berlin resulted in the joint declaration, and this declaration reflects these major elements. It means that that's a positive development. But we have to understand that we cannot trust Russia by simply their wordings. We would like to see real actions, and I do believe that these actions will finally happen, so we will make a good step toward peace and de-escalation in that part of Ukraine.
Deputy Foreign Minister, I just came back from eastern Ukraine this afternoon, and yesterday I was riding around the checkpoints in the area, the Ukrainian checkpoints, and the previous night I saw a lot of military equipment being brought in the direction of Slavyansk, where the pro-Russia separatists are based. And some of it was pretty heavy equipment.
From what part? From Russia?
No, I saw it being brought in by, it was a Ukrainian column of self-propelled howitzers, really big cannons, basically, Uragan, multiple rocket systems. And yesterday when I was going around the checkpoints, I was seeing those, hearing those multiple rocket systems, Grads, being used. The howitzers were also being used every half an hour. You would have a barrage that would last for 2 or 3 minutes, and those are pretty inaccurate weapon systems if you compare them to the modern things that the United States uses, like drones. And the United States gets a lot of criticisms for the collateral damage that's caused with even that kind of technology. If you're talking about moving towards peace, but you're using these Cold War era inaccurate weapons, how do we balance those two things?
How we can protect our country against the aggression that we face? We have a few options, military options, and we have political options. Right now, we go ahead with the political option, and we are committed to that. But definitely, we cannot allow terrorists endanger peace and stability in our country and threaten our independence. It means that we have the sovereign right to protect our people against the attempts to destroy our country. That's why the President of Ukraine continues with his efforts to strengthen our presence over there, because this presence will have another impact on developments, and it may convince the Russian terrorists to stop bloodshed and violence they are continuing.
Well, it's Ukrainian citizens on the other side of the Ukrainian lines as well, in the territories that are controlled by the separatists right now. So when you're firing those indiscriminate shells, they land in places that are full of Ukrainian citizens who you're trying to protect. On the other hand, the Ukrainian government has taken to calling all of the separatist fighters terrorists. And usually when you think of anti-terrorist operation, you think of special forces going into a building, freeing hostages or something along those lines. You don't really think about a barrage of artillery firing over a city. So maybe it's a question of renaming the operation that you have?
I'm not sure about renaming. I would rather speak about the concrete results that may bring peace to this part of Ukraine. Quite obvious and clear that we are talking about the enormous tragedy of this nation suffering the aggression which comes from the Kremlin. And you are quite well aware of that, we are committed to very human and human approach to solving this enormous security challenge.
What is this human approach? You know, how to protect the citizens of Ukraine?
That's why that was another thing that we've been addressed by a number of issues, a number of questions coming from the Ukrainian society, from the international publics. If you deal with terrorists, why don't you use all military tools to stop that violence? And that was the approach, and Jeff does remember that. That was a very strong approach of the government led by Prime Minister Yatsenyuk to avoid any possible casualties and violence. That's why we try to show restraint and to save every human life over there. Unfortunately, and another thing is that the president of Ukraine declared this unilateral ceasefire to underline our approach to bring peace without any use of weapons and military means. What we received back from that, more than 100 attacks against Ukrainian armed forces. What does it mean? It means that the Russian bandits and terrorists used the modern Russian weaponry against Ukrainian soldiers and also against civilians. These actions lead to casualties and they destroy infrastructure. And you know, and you've heard about all those incidents happened on railways and so on, proving to their aggressive tactics.
There is a question to the American ambassador. Should the US supply drones, which is more precise weaponry? That is a question from the audience.
Well, let me just say at this point, Nataliya, it's not an issue that we've talked about at this stage. I think on Simon's question, which is a really important one, we were heartened by the very clear statement in President Poroshenko's remarks early Tuesday morning that it is not the intention of the Ukrainian government to conduct urban warfare. He noted that that has been military practice in the past. It's also been the situation, as I've seen it from a distance so far since the resumption of military operations. I think the key military terrain, as I said earlier, is the Russian border, because that's where the Berlin Agreement is going to be tested. That's where we're going to see whether or not you're going to continue to have tanks and missile systems and everything else coming across the border. And it's important to remember, you know, this is a insurgency situation that did not exist until the 21st of February, before the 21st of February, when President Yanukovych fled the country in shame. This is a manufactured crisis, and it was manufactured largely with the instigation and support of Russian entities and people in Russia. So I think, you know, that's the key question at this stage, and I think our focus is going to be working with the OSCE, supporting the Ukrainian government's efforts. As Danylo said, this has to be a two-way ceasefire. And I keep asking, Nataliya, I keep asking my Ukrainian friends for a good Ukrainian language equivalent of "it takes two to tango." because, and I'm sure there is one, but nobody, probably involves Salo or something.
It sounds like that.
But that this is only going to work if there are two parties. And that was, the government tried unilaterally with a 7-day ceasefire, which the president declared, which was then extended for 3 days. And the failure of performance was Russia and the Russian-supported separatists.
We do have a lot of questions, actually, but there is a question to you, Simon, and we about the different topics. All of them are important. Simon, like, what high-precision equipment might help the Ukrainian government to reduce collateral damage? That would be the question. A lot of people ask that in Ukraine these days.
Well, there's an activist in eastern Ukraine from the Ukrainian side who helps to supply the Ukrainian army with non-lethal aid that they need, like sleeping bags and night vision goggles and things like that. And he has a lot of experience going around the area. His name is Yuri Kasyanov. And he was speaking to me about wanting to have artillery shells which you can actually target after they've been shot. This isn't super high technology. This is technology that's existed for a number of years, but essentially how it works is that the artillery shell gets shot out of a cannon, and there's a wire attached to it, and then the soldier operating the cannon can actually he can change the course of the shell as it flies, and apparently that's something that, isn't massively expensive as far as military technology goes, and that's something that could be very useful. But I think that a lot of the rockets that the Ukrainians are using in their multiple rocket launcher systems right now were made in the 1960s and the 1970s. I've been to checkpoints where I've seen soldiers using sniper rounds produced in the 1940s. So, the weaponry that the Ukrainian military is using right now is incredibly out of date.
There is a number of questions on that, from the different same people. It's probably to you, Danylo. Do you suspect the EU will now make conscious efforts to decrease financial and energy-related dependency on Russia? That's one question. Do Austrian and Italian financial and energy interests lying with Russian weaken Ukrainian support to Ukraine? That's just some of that. There is also another question about Crimea, not about the energy.
LNG export.
Yep, it's all it's here. Could we end reliance on Russian and shale gas with a Victory Garden approach? So there are two things. What do you believe about the EU sanctions and also about the Ukrainian dependency on the gas?
I do believe that there should be more pressure on Russia if Russia doesn't fulfill its obligations as they took them in Geneva, and now they declare that in Berlin. More pressure is needed if Russia continues their aggressive actions. Responding to your question about those economic and other issues, I do believe that this dangerous conflict and crisis not only gives us problems and challenges, but also gives us an opportunity to make very important strategic decisions that will shape our future. I mean that this is right time to build a new strong army which will use new technologies that will protect efficiently Ukrainian nation. I do believe that that's a great chance for Ukraine to fight against corruption and all those diseases that actually are the basic reasons of what was going on and is going on in that part of Ukraine. Because Maidan was about that. We fought against that. And that's a unique chance for this cabinet and for this president to fulfill their obligations taken before the Ukrainian nation. And that's the unique chance for the European Union and for Ukraine to establish a comprehensive strategy, economic strategy, that will diversify our dependency on Russian energy supplies and dependency on the political regime that, as you saw yesterday, President Putin delivered his very clear statement to his diplomats in Moscow. So, dependency on the political regime, which continues suggesting some kind of alternative reality to international order and fundamental principles of coexistence between nations. So this conflict is not only the challenge, but this conflict is an opportunity to build a new Ukraine, to strengthen Europe, and to strengthen the strategic relationship between the United States and the European Union.
I should jump in because we should understand there are a lot of tweets and I encourage you to do so, but by the way, there is enough of them talking about when Ukraine would end this swastika rule and the bloody hands of the regime would stop the violence. We have a bunch of that things as well, and we're talking about that, we admit that. There is a story that, you know, like Ukrainian administrative and political apparatus is still predominantly old-fashioned and Soviet. Not that many things change. Soviet bureaucracy is still
right.
there. So the issue, what a kind of an evidence that it's there is some job done on that. But regarding the reform, there is a question: is there is an outline for parliamentary re-elections and the decentralization of the language regulations?
I would be happy to know the answer for that. The point you made, and the person who raised that question is 100% right. We still have this old-fashioned Soviet-style bureaucracy apparatus that may kill any positive change in this country. And there is another problem with the political psychology that still prevails in this country, post-Soviet psychology. And we have to change it, we have to ruin this. And there is a solution for that. Strong pressure coming from the civil society. And being part of this government, I'm a strong...
Do you feel it? And how it works? I mean, the civil society can pressure, we can sit in the studio and tell a lot of criticism, but
I can tell you that I see it on the Ukrainian front lines, because you can see when you're down there that there are two parallel systems within the Ukrainian military that exist at the same time. You've got the old sort of Soviet bureaucratic military system, and then you've got the grassroots volunteer fighters who are almost, you know, a parallel military force, and they try to organize things in their own way, and they end up putting pressure onto the military organization as well. Because you can, when you go to a checkpoint and there's usually soldiers there from every different type of security service that you have in Ukraine, you can immediately see the guys who are there who are volunteers, and the guys who are there as conscripts, and the guys who are there as part of the Interior Ministry police force of some kind. And it's the ones who are there as volunteers, usually from the National Guard, who are doing all of the organization, getting the supplies to be brought in by other civilian volunteers, and putting pressure on the generals to put changes in place on the ground. And I imagine maybe politically something similar could be happening in Kyiv as well, but I haven't spent as much time here as I have over there.
And the amazing thing is, it's totally organic. It's self-organized. It's like the internet. It's self-replicating and self-correcting. And I think that's when we talked earlier about the Russian propaganda. Nataliya, one of the last times I was on Hromadske TV, in the studio, you ran a clip of Ambassador Churkin at the UN in New York talking about how the Maidan had been organized by a bunch of foreigners. They just don't get it. People who don't understand that it's the Ukrainian people who've reclaimed their own democracy, and who, I think, have demonstrated repeatedly, not just on the Maidan, but on May 25th, when they turned out for elections in the face of threats and intimidation. And I'm confident on all these issues of parliamentary reform and constitutional reform. One of the things that's going to act as a check on the government is precisely this empowered civil society, which, as Ambassador Herbst pointed out, and this is the Tom Friedman point, that these are super empowered civil societies who are using new tools of technology and connectivity to hold their government accountable.
But I do questions to that in a bit different way. It's also raised, they said like that, yes, there is a lot of civil support on the ground especially, but when we have a lot of armed groups, we're talking about the volunteer armed groups coming to the fight, that would be very hard to disarm them after when the struggle ends, as it happened in Libya or elsewhere. What would you answer? We're talking about the volunteer battalions. That is a question from the international audience.
I do
and
believe,
like to work with that.
I do believe that it will happen. This is not an easy task, and let's wait until there will be the necessity to do that. The peace plan of President Poroshenko includes three major parts: de-escalation, restoration, and dialogue. That third part is very important because it may give a chance for all these groups to establish the national dialogue which never before was in this country, in real terms. If we speak about the civil society and how the civil society in the current conditions can influence the process, that's my personal conviction that we have the very strong civil society spirit, but we have very weak civil society institutions. That's why that's very important for all of us, including those who belong to the government, to do everything possible to assist in helping strengthening civil society institutions. And that's a clear demand for the civil society activists to not to rest, to follow this government, to follow this cabinet, to follow this president, to be the watchdog of everything which is going on here in Ukraine. That's very strange for me to be, as being part of this government, to say these words, but that's my personal conviction, and I do believe that that's a solution. Another thing is that if we speak about decentralization, that's another key to change the landscape in this country. So that's a roadmap how we can change it.
I think Twitter is reminding us to come back to the question that we raised earlier about Ukraine putting on the international arena its unhappiness with the annexation of Crimea. We haven't seen Ukraine taking Russia to any international courts. We haven't seen very vocal complaints about the airspace being used by Russian airlines, or, as you were saying before, ships from other countries coming into port. You're not trying to get Russian property arrested abroad over the probably billions or even maybe $1 trillion worth of property that was taken from Ukraine in Crimea. Why isn't Ukraine being more vocal over Crimea internationally?
Putting in mind that we do have this question also from Simon and from a lot of people in our audience.
Let me say that all these things are in process. If we speak about the international legal procedures, we should be aware that we should prepare all these cases very carefully so we can gain a good success and good results. And I do believe that the legal team which works in our Ministry of Justice will succeed in this very difficult task. That's why this cabinet continues its efforts to have all necessary, to start all necessary legal cases.
Can you give us a couple of examples, maybe, of the sort of things that you would try to do? Would you try to, for example, get an Aeroflot plane that lands in London arrested?
I would be happy to answer it, but I really believe that the Ministry of Justice should give the clear vision of that, because I don't want to bite my tongue before we present our cases. That's a very delicate, important issue that should be done very carefully, and this is not that a public matter that should be advertised. Let this cabinet do its job in preparing all these cases, and I do believe that this cabinet will succeed in that. Let me also say, from the political standpoint, as the representative of the foreign minister, I will say that there is no doubt no normalization is possible with Russia until the Crimea is back. And this question is out of any discussion. That's our territory, and the Crimea will be back to Ukraine.
But there is another question. The Ukrainian citizen Oleg Sentsov and 3 others now were taken from the Ukrainian territory, Crimea, to Moscow. They are...
Gennady Afanasyev as well was somebody we interviewed in one of our reports on vicenews.com. He's one of the 4 people who's been sent to Moscow, captured, accused of a terrorist plot.
Yeah, but that's the question. What is clearly done? Because they are already in Moscow jail, facing the life sentence.
Yeah, that's a completely shameless situation. And
Probably such a filmmaker.
let me say very clearly that we have a number of very serious cases, including the case of Oleg Sentsov and others. We also have 2 young persons caught in Kursk region, and Russian authorities do not allow them get back to Ukraine.
So what's going on with them? What is the foreign minister doing?
Let me finish with my idea. We have a number of cases that we are doing everything possible to save these people. All our consular representatives that are still in Russia, they follow this, and actually they, there is a huge number of efforts already done, but there is a shameless behavior coming from the Kremlin, because we do understand that's a clear political aim not to allow these people get back to Ukraine.
Don't the Geneva Conventions apply to them? Couldn't you trade them?
Have you seen the answer that we received from Russia with regard to Sentsov? They don't want to communicate on this matter, and that's a completely shameless violation of any international standards. That's why we raise this issue constantly on every international fora to bring the international attention to this issue, and we will continue with that.
Yeah.
Nataliya, let me jump in for a second.
Yeah, I wanted actually, because it's like it's kind of tactics of extraordinary rendition. We know in a way when the person from one part of the country is overtaken to another.
But in defense of my colleague and friend, the deputy foreign minister, Putin threw out the rule book when he invaded and annexed Crimea. Nobody knows what to do with this situation because it hasn't happened for decades. And so there's a lot of novel international law that's going to be developed in the course of the litigation, which I'm sure is going to come. The United States and many of our European partners have been talking to Danylo's team and to the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice as we try to explore what the different legal avenues would be. I would note also a critical element of this for the United States, and it goes to our non-recognition of Russia's illegal act. We have already imposed significant sanctions against Russian entities who have been involved in the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, who have been involved in the expropriation of Ukrainian assets in Crimea, like Chorny More and Naftogaz. And one thing I can promise you is that that's going to be a huge break on any kind of international investment in Crimea as long as the Russian occupation continues. So both of you raise important issues, and it's in the first instance the Ukrainian government's place to respond. But I would simply note that for all of us in the international system, in the rule-based international system, we have a collective interest in upholding the standards and international practices that Putin shattered at the end of February. And it's going to take a while to figure out how we do this in a way that doesn't compromise Ukraine's sovereign rights in Crimea. And Ukraine has to be very careful not to do anything vis-a-vis Russia that provides a legal recognition to what is an inherently illegal act. So sorry, that's a diversion to law school for a minute, but important issues.
Yes, thank you, Geoff. Thank you very much for this clear support and defense, as you said. But the major thing that we have to defend our national interest, and we are doing this. The conflict that we see is of unprecedented nature, and it's difficult to speak with the wall and to convince the wall. Right now, we see the wall of chauvinism, the wall of clear violations against the international order and fundamental principles, and we deal with that. I do believe that we will consolidate the international, and we have already done this, the international solidarity against this aggression, and also the solidarity that may help save our people, as Oleg Sentsov and others who remain hostage of the Kremlin.
It's going on to the end of the show, but there are short questions to you, like in particular. So there was a question to Jeff Pyatt. What steps are being taken by the US government to speed up LNG export terminal construction? And it's about the energy and how can the US government assist Poland in accelerating shale gas exportation? So these are...
Yeah, since we're in the lightning round, just to say, our Department of Energy is accelerating the review of LNG export permits. Long term, this is one of the most important issues to Ukraine's economic and political security. The United States is going to be an important partner, and Ukraine, 10 years from now, could be a very wealthy country on the basis of its shale gas resources, and we hope that American companies will be a part of that.
There is also the question to Danylo shortly, when would you appoint the Ukrainian ambassador to France? There are like a lot of people who are all the time very careful about what's happening in France and with the French support to Ukraine.
I do believe that the president of Ukraine will take this decision, and after having all necessary diplomatic procedures, Ukraine will appoint all ambassadors to those countries where we still wait for this.
Is there any time plan? Because I do believe that there are people, the Ukrainians all over Europe are waiting till these ambassadors come so they can have some appeal.
Let me say that I do believe that our president is considering proper candidates for all these nominations. That's why I hope that the president will take all necessary decisions as soon as possible.
And before the final remarks, Simon, I was asked to ask you, do you have any proof that the Ukrainian army fired rockets at the people's houses?
Absolutely not. I have no idea where those rockets landed. I only heard them being fired, and I saw the muzzle flares of howitzers being fired. But from where I was on the Ukrainian side of the lines, it's impossible for me to know where they landed.
Let me say, if I may, because I do feel that we are at the end of something.
Yep, and...
Okay, if I may, that, you know, I'm really happy that the foreign ministry, the Ukrainian foreign ministry, enjoys strong support coming from the Ukrainian society. We are doing our best to defend the national interests. And I hope that together with our civil society, together with our nation, we will succeed. The challenge that we face is enormous. The scope of lies and double standards that come from Russia are enormous. And I do believe that everything what we are doing is an adequate response to the tremendous threat to international and Ukrainian peace and stability. So I do thank for the support that we feel.
We have the closing remarks, like what would be also to you, Jeff, what are the next 3 steps that you want to see and that should take place? Like a reasonable things. Well, I mean, we can dream, of course.
Good. Well, a couple of quick things. I mean, first of all, it's for the Ukrainian people to decide. That is the fundamental principle of President Obama's approach to this country. It's not for anybody in Moscow or Washington or Brussels to decide the future of this country. It's for the Ukrainian people. So that's one. My second hope would be for the speedy implementation of the European Association Agreement, which is such an important roadmap for the political and economic modernization of this country, and one where the United States is going to support. And my third hope would be for peace in eastern Ukraine. I read with interest Rinat Akhmetov's statement today about the Shakhtar football season. Like Mr. Akhmetov, I very much hope that Shakhtar will play in Donbass Arena this spring, and this fall, excuse me.
But finally, like to summing up, we we've heard a lot of concern. I mean, I was following, for instance, Syria since the beginning of the crisis there, which led to the civil war. And there was so much support in the world, so many things. And it was clear that, like, there was always thing that after 8 months, the arms were taken, and then everybody warned that if you don't do anything at this point, there would be maybe foreign weapon coming, and the foreign weapon came, and then everybody were talking. But if you don't do anything, the jihadists would come, and they came. And this, like waiting position, we know what it led to in Syria. Do you think that it's what can be done shortly, like to stop the thing in Ukraine, that we won't have any like a real civil conflict, which might raise if the Kremlin tries hard?
No, it's a long conversation, but just let me say, Ukraine is not Syria. It's a democracy with strong civil society, a border with 4 EU member states, tremendous agricultural resources, energy resources. This should be a very wealthy country. It's been poorly governed, and now the Ukrainian people have retaken the democratic mandate and have reclaimed their democracy in a way that makes me quite optimistic about where Ukraine will go over the long term. I wish that people in Moscow would understand that and would understand what the Ukrainian people are looking for.
That's a great answer, Jeff. I do share this. I do share this but also let me add that we have to have a strong political will. We have to continue with all our peaceful efforts to stop the violence in the eastern part of Ukraine, but with no compromises with our future, with our national security, and with our will to live in the strong European democratic country.
You mean peaceful and not just peaceful?
Let me say that we are committed to peaceful efforts, but if Russia continues their efforts to undermine peace and stability of Ukraine, there is no other option but to continue to protect our people against the bloodshed and violence which comes from the Russian terrorists.
That was Deputy Foreign Minister Danylo Lubkivsky in our studio today. Not just, it was the special webcast of Hromadske, Ukrainian online independent television, and the Atlantic Council. We were very happy to have here the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Geoffrey Pyatt, and thanks a lot, Simon, for being here, moderating, and asking the right questions.
It was really fun and interesting.
No, thanks, Nataliya. Thanks, Simon. I was saying earlier before the broadcast, for so many of us, Simon's
While we're
dispatches,
still online, though, on
We're
TV,
still online, yeah.
Can Vice News get a separate interview?
work with my team.
And I do.
But I want to say how much we all admire the reporting that Simon's been doing over the past 4 months, because it's been compelling, must-see TV.
Thanks.
And I do thank Nataliya and I do thank Simon for this very interesting discussion. So I would be happy to continue with some other topics and issues that we may discuss at any other option or occasion.
What we understand, we would go on with that on the regular basis with the help of the Atlantic Council. For us, it's very important that we can answer from Kiev studio, from Ukraine, the questions of the international audience, which probably not always have enough information. Thanks a lot. And there would be something after our air that I'm taking for our Ukrainian Hromadske viewers. So you go on. Будь ласка, продовжуйте нас дивитися на Громадському. Щось має бути цікаве, редактори точно обіцяють.